So yeah, our first talk is from our rising star. Yeah, young scientist, early career investigator. So the work is the environmental conditions, treatments, and exposures ontology, ECTO, collecting toxicology and exposure to health and beyond. Lauren Chen. So I will leave the stadium for you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. Hope you got some coffee. We got a lot of good stuff happening today. So thank you for the kind introduction. And yes, we will be talking about ECTO, or this environmental conditions, treatments, and exposures ontology. So just a quick brief overview of what we're chatting about today. Obviously, I'm going to give you an intel as to what is ECTO and where is the need for ECTO. We're going to talk through current exposure content that exists in ontologies and in other, kind of data sources. We're talking about contributing to ECTO and what that looks like, some of the use cases for ECTO, as well as some future directions. So ECTO is a new-ish ontology, so it's always nice to know what's going on. What is this? So that's the environmental conditions, treatments, and exposures ontology. And so this is mostly an ontology that's focused on trying to describe environmental exposures. And this can be both naturally occurring exposures, like you walk outside and the sun hits you, or you eat some food and you get exposed to some nutrients, or it could be those controlled types of exposures, like if you have rats that you're feeding a specific thing, or zebrafish embryos that you're exposing to a specific chemical. So it kind of is wide ranging in terms of the content that's in there, but it's generally looking at environmental exposures. It is also intended to be species agnostic. So it is not looking specifically just at humans. It literally be about any organism. So really kind of a wide swath of things that can be encompassed in ECTO, all things focused on this exposure event and in terms of like the actual exposure process itself. So if we think about, what is currently existing in resources, like why do we even need this new ontology, right? You can think about some of the resources that are currently available for environmental health and toxicology. And, if you're familiar with this realm, you probably know there's a lot of data sources. It could be data repositories, it could be, sets of survey questions, it could be sampling of wastewater, what have you. There's lots of data that's kind of in and around this area. And as, many of us are dealing with, we always want to harmonize that data and try and do something interesting with it and combine it all together. And obviously that's really difficult because, this is coming from academia and government bodies and all these different places that just use different terminology to speak about exposures and toxicology. And it's just really difficult for us to try and harmonize these very heterogeneous, not only data types, but language that we use to describe them. So then if we think more about, what is existing in kind of this ontology space, we know we have some data that exists related to environmental exposures, but what is ontologies doing to kind of maybe structure some of that language? Well, if we think about, exposures as like the actual, like if we're looking at terminology specifically related to the event of an exposure, we might think of kind of pieces of that exposure event, and some of those pieces are currently existing in ontologies. So if you think about like a stimuli of some variety, if you're exposed to something, that stimulus that you're exposed to, we do have a lot of great terminology that helps to represent those things. So things like environmental materials, foods, chemicals, etc. Right? I'm sure lights are going off in your head of like, duh, Envo has a lot of those things, Kebi has a lot of those things. We are not trying to redo any of those existing resources, but those are really good at describing the actual stimuli themselves. We're also interested in this kind of exposure model of things, of being able to link on the other side to some hopefully positive and negative health outcomes, because you could have a good or a bad exposure that leads to something on the other end. And we do have some resources that help to model things like phenotypes and disease. And I mean, I guess arguably they kind of sound like negative outcomes, but you can have positive exposures too. Okay, so those are all things that we're kind of interested in including in our modeling here. And then we also have species specific exposure ontologies. So we have ontologies that are looking at like zebrafish experimental conditions or plant experimental conditions. And so those are some species specific types of exposure ontologies. So we have things that they're kind of in and around this exposure terminology piece, but we're really only hitting like small aspects of it. or we're hitting really species-specific things, and we're not actually getting the like exposure event as a process type terminology, also in a species-agnostic way. So maybe if you people are in the exposure realm, you thought, but there is an exposure ontology, right? And so there's this exposure ontology called ECTO. And so we're thinking, well, what's an ECTO and why do we need even more than what's an ECTO? So if you're familiar with ECTO at all, if you've taken a look at that kind of hierarchy, you might have noticed there's not a lot of content in ECTO. ECTO is really slim in what is included in it. And I think I like to consider ECTO more of a schema of this group, the Comparative Toxicogenomics Database group. They actually put together ECTO using all of their, toxicology background and asking lots of stakeholders that are potential users of things like ontologies to represent exposures. And they tried to put together this way of describing what an exposure event looks like using kind of some controlled vocabulary. And so what they have included in ECTO is things like exposure event, that's a very broad class, or exposure stimulus, exposure receptor, exposure outcome, right? But if you actually were interested in doing something like a distinct exposure, like exposure to lead or any other chemical or any other stimuli, that is not going to be contained in ECTO. That's not the purpose of ECTO. They're not looking to make those terms. It is exclusively just trying to represent kind of what this schematic looks like. So for us, trying to create more of these specific terms, ECTO is a really nice, good structured schema for us to use to kind of capitalize to make some more distinct exposure terms. So really this provides good foundation for us, but it's not quite still hitting the mark for what we need for exposures. So then how does ECTO translate into ECTO? Sorry, the names are so similar, so I'll try and be very specific on how I say them for you. But if we look on the left-hand side, you can see that there's stimulus, exposure event, receptor outcome, and we can actually translate that whole schema into more specific types of terminology. So we could utilize this exposure event, and instead of just saying there's an exposure event that occurs, we could actually be talking specifically maybe about an exposure to chlorpyrifos. So if you're familiar with chlorpyrifos, it's agricultural chemical that can be sprayed on a variety of plants. And so in this instance, you can see that we can kind of further model an interesting exposure to chlorpyrifos, being able to note that the exposure stimulus is chlorpyrifos. We have a medium in this case, which is an apple. We have a route, which is ingestion. And so we're seeing that this human is going to eat this chlorpyrifos exposed apple. So then they're going to be in turn exposed to the chlorpyrifos. For all of our terms, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that term creation happens for us, we do require that there's a stimuli in all of the terms, at least at this point. So you'll see most of our terms will look like exposure to variable field. But you can have optionally the inclusion of mediums and routes as you like. And then on the far right side, you can see in the dark gray, these are not kinds of things that we would necessarily include in ECTO itself, but it is interesting for us to be able to say, on the other end of an exposure, something is probably going to happen, right? And so what is of interest to us over there? And so being able to connect to things like, an increased metabolite level or a disease of some variety is of interest to us to be able to kind of connect in that full picture of what's happening with the exposure. So I said I would talk a little bit more about class development. And we, for the most part, when we're creating classes in ECTO or these exposure terms, are using dead simple al design patterns, otherwise known as DOSDPS. And that helps us to really efficiently make a lot of classes at once. So as I kind of already mentioned, for most of our terms, they look like exposure to variable field. And then you can add those additional variable fields if you're interested in adding some medium and route information, but the basics of it is going to be at least exposure to variable field. So for us, that variable field, where we're talking about a stimuli at first, we are interested in utilizing variables that come from other ontologies. So again, we're not trying to reinvent, CABI or ENVO or anything like that. We want to be leveraging those resources to include that as a component of our exposure event and that process of exposure. So all of those variables get kind of slurped in from other ontologies and get added in to create our more holistic terms in that case. So on the right hand side of the screen, you can see an example of kind of the, I guess, prettified version of what a YAML file looks like if you're writing the patterns. But you can imagine some nice pattern that's been developed that provides structure for how we're going to create the term label, how we're going to create the logical axioms, and what kind of appropriate variables are like allowed to fill in each of those fields. So for here, if we're looking at a pattern that's called exposure to chemical medium route, each of those different colors is going to be a different variable field. And as you can imagine, I'm going to fill those variable fields with a chemical, a medium, and a route that is suitable. So in the second row in the gray section, you can see that the chemical I've chosen is that chlorpyrifos, the medium is apple, the route is ingestion. Then as you can see in the blue section, that's the pattern generated information. So, these patterns can include whatever you want. You can provide, more or less things depending on how you want to structure them. But in this instance, we're putting together like the term label itself as well as the logical definition. Sorry, I'm just gonna make it so I don't see all these floating things. Okay, great. So in this case, we have this term exposure to chlorpyrifos in apple via ingestion, and then we get the logical definition. Exposure event has exposure stimulus, some chlorpyrifos, has exposure medium, some apple, and has exposure route, some ingestion, right? So all those things have been generated through the pattern. And then if you, really want to do any kind of hand curation things, you're obviously welcome to, go to Protégé and add those things as you like. But for the most part, this is how we're producing a majority of the classes for ECTO. Okay, so I think it's also interesting to discuss, what kind of relationships we have that are related to exposure. And so this is the related via exposure branch of RO. And so as you can kind of see from this, if we're looking at some of the available relationships, it's things like has exposure receptor, has exposure route. And for the most part, in my mind, they seem to be things that kind of are relating and describing what's happening internally in the exposure event. So if I had an exposure event term, I would point to has exposure stimulus, some chemical, or has exposure medium or route, some this, that, or the other, right? But it's not necessarily offering what I think we still probably need to start requesting is, those connections that are going to happen between the organism and the exposure itself, because that's, of course, of interest to us. So I think at the moment, the relationships that we have are really doing a good job of describing, what's happening in the exposure event, but not necessarily branching to connect that to organisms. So I think there's still some room for us to potentially look at using other existing relationships to do that, or potentially request some new terms as well. So if you've been sitting here and you've been thinking, man, this is such a nice simplified version of how we talk about exposures, because it really is, in all honesty. Exposures themselves are super tricky because it's just difficult to have all the understanding of all the various pieces of information that you want to include, and then trying to mush all that into like one singular model can be difficult. So if you're thinking that exposure modeling is hard, you're right. But so let's talk through an example of something that we've used as one of our use cases. So in this instance, we are looking at survey questions that someone responded to describe their environmental exposures. And so in question 1, it says, have you ever been exposed to alkalis for 15 minutes a week or more in any job that you've ever held? We'll say that this person says yes, and they've been exposed. They chose sodium hydroxide is what they were exposed to. Okay, great. So we know that they're exposed to sodium hydroxide. They self-reported that to us. What other information do we have? So we have a second question that says, when you're exposed to alkalis at work, how often were you exposed? And this person can say, select whatever answer applies. And in this case, it's at least once per week. Third and fourth question here are asking what year did you start and what year did you stop being exposed to those alkalis in any job that you've held? And this person said 1983 to 1987. Okay, well, we're getting good chunks of information here to kind of structure what's happening in the exposure. And you can see on the lower portion, if we were interested in trying to, kind of provide some exposures to this person, we have that person ID. We could, have a relation that says has exposure, and then has that exposure to sodium hydroxide. And we do know some little extra tidbits of information. We know that the time course of exposure they reported was, 1983 to 1987. So maybe this kind of ambiguous 5-year-ish maybe span, right? And then we also see that they said at least once per week they were exposed. So I guess if I'm doing some strong assumptions here, I could say maybe this person was exposed, 260-ish times. Maybe, right? So as you hear these like maybes and I'm not sure, right? This is just the layers of complexity that come in with exposures, right? So we don't actually know how much this person was exposed. We have a ballpark range of how much they were exposed. We don't really truly know the route that they were exposed. I don't know if they were handling these chemicals. I don't know if they, just saw them across the room and said, I'm exposed because I see a jar of sodium hydroxide, right? I don't know any of those things about how this is working. I don't know if they were wearing PPE, if they were actively handling it. I don't know what concentrations they were. So you can see the layers of things that you're like, man, I just really wish I could, model that or include that somewhere in what I want to talk about with exposures. And so we are still kind of doing a think as to how we want to do that with ECTO, but we do have a proposed annotation model, and this is just a partial view because there's obviously a variety of more fields that you could include here. But if we were interested in talking about exposures, we really want to be able to capture things like the concentration. If it's known, we want to know the number of times they might have been exposed, the time span at which they were exposed, if there's any evidence that's related. We want to be able to capture those pieces. And so for us, I think we're most interested in capturing that within annotations, just because when you're looking at, this is going to be the continuous debate of forever of pre-composed and post-composed. But, when we're looking at pre-composed terms, we really want things that are going to be reusable. And when you really get into the nitty-gritty and the complexities of exposures, there's a lot of times where you're going to have very, very specific, very distinct exposures that you just need an annotation model for. So if you want to talk about this annotation model, please let's talk about it more, because there's, I think, a lot of room still for growth and development with this proposed model. So I don't even know if we have time for this week comic anymore because we're running late. But I just wanted to slow things down before we delve into use cases. So anyway, have a laugh about exposures, and yeah. Okay, cool. So talking about some use cases. One of our most interesting use cases, and Anna Maria is from NIEHS here, so we've already talked about PEGS, but this personalized environment and genome study. PEGS is a set of surveys as well as genetic information that comes from NIEHS, and the NIEHS group is really interested in trying to kind of leverage some of the data that they have from this PEGS project and try and see if they can come up with any interesting inferences that might come from the use of ontologies. And so some of the things that we've worked on with their group, as well as taking their data and kind of matching it up with other data, is we've been really interested in looking at how these surveys can be aligned with ontologies. And so in the top row, you can see this blue question. You could ask a question, and this is actually from the Nurses Health Study, the blue box. So you could ask a question, Nurses Health Study, say, how often on average do you drink in milk? We're talking about 2% milk. How often do you drink that? And then in the PEGS question in pink, they ask the same question, but, kind of almost slightly worded a little differently. It's not perfectly compatible. Of course, you can't pick the same answer ranges, so it's not directly necessarily comparable. There's a little bit of manual work that needs to happen to make those fit together. And then in purple, you have a kind of also similar question that's asking about how often you're exposed to milk. Doesn't say anything about 2%, doesn't say anything about drinking an 8-ounce glass, but we're still talking about milk exposure here, right? And so we're looking at ways to just, at the moment, for the most part, manual, trying to identify the interesting exposures that are happening and being described in these surveys, and trying to coordinate the survey questions with some exposure terms to see if there's opportunities for us to kind of branch that across to other data sets. So I think that food examples are most interesting to me because I'm a dietitian, but for food type things, it is also interesting being that food on, because again, all of our terms have baked in stimuli, right? So in this instance, we have baked in food on terms. So if we are referencing, this food on term in our ECTO term, then we can also have the opportunity to link that to other data sources that also use food on. So like USDA's Food Data Central is a great resource that provides specific nutrient information for a variety of foods. And you can go all the way from that survey question to an ECTO term, seeing the food on term that's referenced, and get to that nutrient content. So it's a lot more than you would have gotten if you, just said, hey, here's this survey question, and maybe you could have looked up what it was in milk, and that's fine too, but it's a little faster this way. So another interesting thing that PEGS was looking for is they were really interested in looking at mixtures and seeing how there's components of mixtures that you might be exposed to, and that maybe, we talked a little bit yesterday, Chris was mentioning, like, don't always trust the label, right? So you could have labels for terms and maybe you don't actually know anything interesting about the term, but this is an opportunity to provide, some additional logical axioms that tell you what's actually in a composite exposure in a mixture. So they're really interested in being able to say, if you're exposed to X, Y, and Z things, and all three of those things actually have subcomponents that are like containing lead, but you would have never known that just from the term label. It's interesting to be able to slurp those all together and say, well, if you're exposed to all three of these things, that's actually a lot of lead exposure that's occurring, and maybe that's related to some of the health outcomes that you might see on the other end. So this is just showing an example of how we kind of linked together a few different ontologies to be able to do that mixture modeling. So you can see the top kind of lighter color is those ECTO terms, so this exposure to methylcellulose paste. And obviously that lives in the exposure to environmental material branch. And then you can see that the exposure stimulus that we're going to reference in the ECTO term is an ENVO term for methyl cellulose paste. And then ENVO helped us to create some of these terms that have primarily composed of or has part relations to give us those subcomponents of the mixture. So if you're interested in looking at, tell me all the times that people were exposed to methyl cellulose, you could, you would in theory be able to kind of see this exposure pop up and see that someone was exposed to methyl cellulose. And of course, methyl cellulose paste, if it had a more complex label, maybe you wouldn't, it wouldn't feel so, naturally inherent there. But anyway, this is just kind of showing how we're branching together a few different ontologies to be able to do those mixtures. So, I think this coordination of surveys is pretty interesting, just for the sake of, we have a lot of survey data, and being able to link some survey data together between surveys and across surveys is of high interest for folks. And so being able to say things like, this person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was exposed to cow milk, they drink cow milk, and they also experience hypertension, and maybe somebody else too, this other person, also drinks cow milk and also experiences hypertension. When we start to add in like a variety of hundreds of survey questions and thousands of patients, it creates an interesting web where we hope to be able to see some patterns in exposures and potentially patterns in some of these outcomes, these disease or phenotype or positive outcomes, right, that might be related to the exposures. So changing course just a touch. I think, we've also had good discussion this week of trying to create data that is, born interoperable or is already using ontologies when it's created. So our second use case that I want to talk to you about is we did a small investigation that was looking at trying to assess within zebrafish researchers from a variety of labs if they could consistently label zebrafish larvae that had morphological malformations. And so that was done in 2 different surveys. And the first survey that was given to zebrafish researchers to identify the various morphological malformations was one where they got to use whatever language they wanted. They got to say whatever they wanted, use whatever words they wanted, and that's great. And then the second one, they got to use only zebrafish phenotype ontology terms, and they had definitions provided for those, and they were able to kind of classify the morphological malformations using just that language. And so, of course, we're looking for survey consistency and repeatability of the ratings for how people are classifying these images. Spoiler alert, you already know the answer to this, right? Can you guess which one was better? The second one, oh yeah, okay. So of course, standardized language is gonna be helpful, right? Because, everyone talks about things differently, everyone uses different language, and that could be, even within your lab or across labs, like of course you're gonna have differences. So while it's not perfect, offering this opportunity for structured language is of course helpful. And so we think that that would also span additionally into the realm of, what are these zebrafish being exposed to, right? Like people can call chemicals all sorts of things, like chemical nomenclature is vast, right? So even if you used one name versus the other name for something, like, yes, again, you could go look it up and that's fine, but wouldn't it be nice if it was all interoperable already, right? So being able to use exposure terms for things like zebrafish investigations, you could just at the top of things say, okay, well, we're looking at aldehyde exposures, and in this instance, we're looking at formaldehyde exposures, and you can kind of utilize the ontologies to structure those exposures right from the start in this kind of a controlled intervention type setting. So I know, see, we're almost out of time, and I want to have time for questions. So we'll go to future directions of things for ECTO. So if you go on our issue tracker, you'll see that there's a bunch of issues that are complex and have a lot of things that we're still trying to figure out what we want to do with, because as I kind of noted earlier, exposures are hard. So there's lots of people asking for complex mixtures, things like human conditions that we have not quite, delved into yet. People are wondering about exposure to poverty or exposure to homelessness, what does that look like, and how can we provide terminology for that is of interest to us. Multi-layered exposures, like if you went and stood outside and you're wearing sunscreen, what does that exposure really look like if you have some level of protection potentially? So lots and lots of things that we're kind of, trying to ruminate on. So if you have thoughts or feelings on these, please feel free to engage on our issues. Would be awesome. And then we also, of course, are always requesting new terms, because everything that we decide that we want to have an ECTO, we again are reliant on other ontologies to have that content to be able to slurp it in for our terms. So we're always requesting new terms. And, we're really interested, obviously, ECTO is a part of the MARC initiative projects. So if we can capitalize on trying to incorporate ECTO into the MARC initiative knowledge graph and try and see if there's any interesting inferences that come from that, that is kind of one of our future goals as well. So Thank you so much to all of our awesome ECTO team. Plenty of those humans are here. You're awesome. And all of the folks that have contributed to our variety of use cases and contributed data to us. Really appreciate all of you folks. So if you want to talk more about this, obviously catch me here or ask questions now, or you can feel free to send me an email, and there's a link to our repo. And if you're interested in reading the preprint of the paper that this whole talk is based on, it's linked there.
Great, wonderful. So we have we have two microphones. Yeah. First talk, we find out the microphone. But anyway, questions. Yes.
Yeah, so we do have.
Can you repeat the question first? Yeah.
Sorry, the question I believe was, we talk about a lot of exposures to a variety of things, and is there any exposures to organisms? Is that, yeah, okay. So we do have a few terms that are exposures to organisms, and we are kind of looking to continue developing that. I think we've had, some conversations of wanting to just keep the exposure to organism pieces and making sure not to delve into the realms of, what happens if you're exposed to some organism and you get sick, right? So we're really trying to delineate just the exposure to organism pieces, but we do have that content in ECTO.
So I guess related to that, so I know Bjorn Peter's group, including James Overton here, did work on an immune exposures ontology. Is there any commonalities there?
Yeah. So I mean, we've had at least discussions kind of in the COB realms of things of what we could do higher level for exposures that might keep things sorted. Sorry, Dan, what did you?
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. We have had discussions with Bjorn about that and how we can not overlap or contradict each other, and that sort of also falls into the exposures to organism space. Right now, ECTO is more exposures to organisms in terms of allergens, allergic reactions, and things of that nature. But we're really sort of hesitant to try to get into exposures to pathogens, because that is territory, but that's just covered in other ontologies already. And honestly, that's just one of a handful of issues that I would like to have some sort of a workshop where we can come together and the community kind of hash all this out.
Yeah.
Well,
Very much. So in this kind of complex space, there are essentially two approaches. You can generate all of the classes before you use them, or you provide what I think EXO probably did, a framework for which you can then basically just annotate or combine the different components. Now you chose the second, but so the second, the first is to generate them. But you regenerate all these classes, but hopefully, because otherwise, I mean, if it's open-ended and you're never gonna use them,
right?
Then there's no real point. Now, do you have any hope of having a complete ontology at some point where you say, okay, well, roughly complete or mostly complete ontology? And what is the advantage of actually doing what you are doing, recreating them instead of simply just providing already a design pattern template, which you also kind of use based on EXO and then just put it together on demand?
Yeah. I mean, I think we could all go back and forth of our preferences for pre-composition and post-composition, right? So I'm sure there's feelings on this. But I think for the most part, we're not trying to, sit and make every single term in every ontology that could be a stimulus, right, into an ECTO term. Like that just isn't feasible and isn't really a smart use of time and just overinflates ontology, right? But we are interested in ones that are specific to use cases. So if there's use cases that are asking for this type of content, we're creating pretty much trying to create just the classes that are going to be reused and that are specifically requested. So it's, we're not trying to get to the super nitty gritty. Like if you have a lot of details and it's a really complex exposure, that's why we have an annotation model and why we hope to kind of push for, adding some of that in post composition as opposed to creating these really like rabbit hole type terms. So.